So today, I'm going to tell you what the best decks in the game are before the new expansion comes out, and spoiler alert, Druid and Shaman absolutely dominate the meta right now. 6 of the top 10 decks are Druid or Shaman decks, each of which having 3 in the top 10. It's absolutely absurd, and let's just jump into the more specifics here. The first one is going to be Beast Druid. This deck is absurd because there's nothing that the opponent can do in order to stop this deck from constantly developing the board. You have cards that create tokens, Adorable Infestation, Iron Deep Trog. You have the Vibrant Squirrel that creates stuff. You have the Thorngrowth Sentries that for 1 card creates 2 minions. The Oracle Balloon duplicating all of your cheap minions, even mana reduced ones like Umbral Owl and the Matriarch. Then, as long as they can get 1 board to stick, you just play Arbor Up or Pride's Fury or Power of the Wild and completely blow your opponent out of the water. This deck is extremely good. I think it's probably the best deck in the game. It requires no legendaries. It's just that good, and it's cheap for people who want to play on a budget. So the next deck on the list is Aggro Priest. This is similar to Beast and Token Druid. I'll get into Token Druid in a second, in the sense that you try to get a wide board and you can redevelop at least a couple of times with a Raised Dead and a little bit of draw, but it's not as consistent, right? Beast and Aggro Druid can develop really wide boards over and over and over again because they have so many token generators. This just has Raised Dead. The difference is this deck can close out games much faster. I have consistently won games with this deck on turn 4. Like, out of 10 games that I played, 2 or 3 of them I won on turn 4 last time I played this deck on stream, which is just crazy. If you can get that Void Touch Attendant out turn 1 and protect it with the Guardian Augmergent so it doesn't die, and maybe get a couple of Iron Deep Trogs out there that scale really wide really quickly, you can easily win the game early on. And that's basically where this deck shines. You can also sometimes yoink a big taunt minion near the end of the game with Najak, which is awesome. And then you have good direct damage or burst damage with Mr. Smite and the Defias Lepers, turn 8, which is a pretty cool combo as well. The deck is not quite as strong as Beast Druid, but it's definitely very comparable and still fairly cheap. You don't need an Najak or Serene. You could potentially just run 2 of the Chaplains and you're good to go. So next on the list is Buff Paladin, which I was a little bit surprised about at first, but then I thought about it and was like, wait, I'm personally 11-3 with it this season, and last season was 9-5, and it does very well against Ramp Druid, and it actually does okay against more aggressive board-based matchups because you have a lot of minions on the board yourself. And then you have a card that makes you take half damage, so even burn combo decks can sometimes lose to you if you can get Cariel out soon enough. So then I was like, wait, this deck is actually broken. It's covering all of the bases. And essentially what you want to do with this deck is you want to try to get a minion to stick on the board early, play Blessing of Authority on it, then Sunwing Squawker the very next turn, usually about turn 6, and then either close the game out with that, or Wind Fury on other big minions, or Mr. Smite to close out the game, or just the infinite value that Lightforged Cariel gives you. Or just run them down early game because you're kind of aggressive into some matchups. So next up is Bolner Shaman, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Shaman has all of its top decks being top decks because of Snowfall Guardian. If Snowfall Guardian didn't exist, Shaman would not be good. Literally every single top tier Shaman deck runs this card with the Brilliant Macaw. The ability to create 4 enormous minions while also stalling out your opponent turn after turn after turn is just something nobody can really match. And if your opponent isn't running a board-based matchup, you can win the game by Lightning Blooming out a Wildpaw Cavern and getting pressure that way, or burning your opponent down with multiple different burn spells if they're going for more of a combo, less board-centric style. This deck is just able to beat basically anything, and I will admit, things like Lightforged Cariel can be a bit of a problem for this deck, and decks that can get a huge amount of armor. But even then, you're fast and aggressive enough to where if they don't hit the nuts, you can usually kill them before they get a lot of armor. Anyway, like against Druid or even Warrior. Now on to another Druid deck. This is very similar to Beast Druid, except this one is more focused on being really aggressive early game, which means it doesn't have quite the strength late game. As you can see with this deck, it doesn't run the Pride's Fury, which is a great way to pump up the board. Same with the Power of the Wild, but it has more minions and more ways of just constantly applying that pressure, which is something the opponent can't usually deal with super early. Because a lot of the time, they'll be like, okay, turn 1, we have to use a removal on the Iron Deep Trog or the Peasant. And then that means by turn 2, you got the Bone Shoe Brawler, which sometimes you can use the Guardian Augmergent on if you have the coin. And then if they use removal on that, The Oracle of Elune comes out, and there's nothing they can do. Not to mention the fact that Drekthar is able to pull out multiple minions, and if you're able to just develop even a small board, Arbor Up is insane. So I think this deck is worse than Beast Druid, but it's faster. So if you want to play slightly faster games and you are okay with a slightly lower win rate, this deck will still be phenomenal. Phenomenal for climbing. And now, turning away from aggro, Druid also has one of the best, if not the best, greedy deck in the game in Spell Druid, which makes it almost impossible to mulligan against because you're like, if it's Spell Ramp Druid, I have to mulligan for something aggressive, but if I'm against aggro, I need to mulligan for more control tools to stay alive. It's really difficult to play against Druid right now, which makes it even better to play, and that might be why the win rates of these decks are higher than everything else in the game right now, because you don't exactly know what you need to mulligan for. But that aside, this deck is strong, and you guys could probably guess because you get insane ramp, you can get up to 20 mana, and then you're gonna just win the game with Kazakusan and the treasures. Not to mention the fact that some versions run Onyxia if you want. Best in Shell and Scale of Onyxia, if you're able to double activate those, can be, or not Scale, but double activate Best in Shell can be very difficult for an aggro deck to deal with. You have multiple ways of gaining a decent amount of armor, and then late game resizing pouch, if Kazakusan isn't enough to win the game, is usually enough to win the game as well. It's just a really greedy deck that's very reliable in getting to the late game, which means that it's going to do well. Finally, we get to a deck that isn't one of the like big two, Shaman and Druid. Yes, Paladin had one earlier, but we get to a new one, and that is Face Hunter. Face Hunter is, in my opinion, a little bit better than Quest Hunter, just because this deck is a little bit more proactive. You don't need to have minions to target with your spells in order to progress. Like what I do, especially with like Control Warrior and slower decks, is I just don't play minions against Quest Hunter, and the Quest Hunter has their quest is completely delayed, and by the time they finish it, they've fallen behind. Face Hunter is not that way. Face Hunter, you slam minions on the board, especially if you can get a Trog out early, and you just hit them. And then you hero power, you play aim shot and quick shot, and you just keep hitting them until they lose. And because of that, it is a slightly better deck than Quest Hunter, but even though Quest Hunter isn't on this list, spoiler alert, it's definitely viable to play, and I'll put a deck code or like at the very end do a quick shout out of Quest Hunter so you can see what it looks like, but yeah, Face Hunter in my opinion is better. It's just an aggro deck. So next is Bolner OTK Shaman, and again, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, this deck is hard carried by Snowfall Guardian and the Brilliant Macaw. If you are a combo deck that needs to hit turn 10, and you can just keep your opponent from playing the game for 2 entire turns, and you do Snowfall Guardian turn 8, Brilliant Macaw turn 9, you can just win the game turn 10 with your combo. That being said, I do think that this is one of the best designed, balanced decks in the game right now, because of the fact that it has multiple moving parts. You need to play Circus Medic and Dunk Tank before you can even attempt the combo, and then you have to get to turn 10, and then you need to have Yashiraj, Bolner, and Lightning Bloom all in your hand at the same time, and a lot of the times you're using Lightning Bloom to survive the early game, so you have to draw a second copy of it, and because of all these things, I just really like the deck. It's high skill cap. Disguise Toast used this deck to get Legend, so you know that it's definitely good, and it's one that an experienced Hearthstone player was able to just jump back into and play. So it's hard, but it's not like insanely so. I just love the deck. I would highly recommend playing this if you want to play a slower control combo deck. So the next deck on the list is another Shaman deck, and this one can run the Snowfall Guardian. Many versions do. I just took it out because all the other Shaman decks have it, and I was just getting sick and tired of it. But this deck does well because of the Doomhammer, and not that many people are running weapon removal anymore. There's only 2 or 3 decks that actually reliably run weapons, and that is Paladin with Lightforged Cariel, and this deck, as well as Weapon Rogue. But Weapon Rogue sees almost no play, so people don't put Rust-Rot Viper in for the potential of 2 kind of low popularity decks popping up, and Ramp Druid can't put it in because it messes up the whole Kazakusan Dragon synergy, which means decks that are usually vulnerable to aggro and burn are just gonna get slammed in the face and lose really quickly to Doomhammer because none of them have a way of interacting with it or countering it. Sometimes decks will have an insane amount of armor, like if you're not able to close out the game fast enough against Warrior, it might be a problem, same with Druid, but shouldn't be a problem because most of the time you're playing at turn 5 anyway because of the Cage Match Custodian, and you're closing the game out by turn 7 with Rockbiter Weapon and Stormstrike. And last, before we get to the honorable mentions that I think are really good decks, is Quest Rogue. Quest Rogue is a top tier deck. It's probably the best rogue deck right now, and it's fairly cheap. You could potentially take out Tenwu and Scab's Cutter Butter and put in this card right here, the SI. I think it's Infiltrator. I forgot the name. I should have had it loaded up, but this one right here, the 4 cost. The SI Infiltrator. It's another SI card. It's good on turn 4 if you don't want to play the SI Informant, and it helps you progress the quest. You could also put in a little bit more burst or direct damage if you want that. You can put in maybe Sinister Strike. It's up to you. Point is, this deck just has really good tempo, and it's pretty consistent in completing its quest now that it has the new SI card, SI Smuggler, which is both good early game for quest completion and late game as a way to get a big minion out and be like a Hail Mary. You got good removal with the SI Assassin and a lot of the little gizmos being very, very high value for their costs. And then you win the game by giving Scab Stealth and then giving him Wind Fury with the Battlegrounds Battlemaster. The next deck on this list is Control Warrior, and we're getting into the honorable mentions now. And I really like Control Warrior. I've had multiple people come on stream and tell me that my Control Warrior video got them to play this deck, and it's been doing extremely well. And I personally am 18-9 with it after trying a couple of different versions. And I think it's really good. You basically, as you saw on this tier list already, most of the top tier decks are aggro burn decks. This is a control hard armor warrior deck, which means it's probably not going to die to a lot of those burn aggro decks. I will admit, Ramp Druid and Spell Druid or whatever are slightly problematic, but you can sometimes snipe an important card with Mutanus. You have Kazakusan of your own, which means if a Druid doesn't get it out early enough, you can match them and have treasures of your own to win. And you have enough armor to where unless they get the 5/1 and then make a whole bunch of copies of it with the coin, you actually have enough armor and removal to stay alive for a decent amount of time. The next deck on this list is Owl OTK Warlock. I really like this deck. I think it's a lot better than people give it credit for. It was nerfed a couple of times back in the day, and then people were like, okay, let's stop playing it. And now it's kind of flying under the radar. I think that it has a fast enough OTK and does enough damage to beat Spell Druid, especially if they don't have Overgrowth and Guff. If they have Overgrowth and Guff into Kazakusan turn 6 or whatever, you're just gonna lose. There's no shame in that. But if they don't have the nuts, this deck is able to get its OTK out consistently enough and fast enough to actually beat that. You also have a ton of control with Drain Soul, Soul Shear, School Spirits, Grimmer of Sacrifice, Mortal Coil, Touch of Netherzim. So board-based matchups are actually pretty easy for you as well. I will admit some matchups might get enough armor or minions on the board to survive your OTK, and that sucks, but most of the time the OTK will end up working out for you. And once you learn how to play the deck well, it just becomes so fun to pilot. I would highly recommend this deck. It's just super duper fun to me. And last, well, second to last, is Charge Warrior. Very, very similar to Control Warrior, except instead of Kazakusan being your late game, it's the Captain along with the Faceless Manipulator and the Battleground Battlemaster. The idea is still the same though. Control the board, win through attrition if you're against aggro, and win through your late game win condition in Charge Warrior. Instead of Kazakusan, again, it is an OTK that can do upwards of 56 damage. And I threw in Mr. Smite because with him added in, the combo can now do up to, I think it was 68 damage if you have both to the fronts. So pretty cool. I would highly recommend trying this deck out. It's really, really good. I think I went 9-2 with it the other day. So yeah, it's quite solid. And last but not least is Curse Warlock. Curse Warlock is a deck that I think is absolutely phenomenal. And I went 9-2 with it. You have a couple of different win conditions in this deck. You have Kazakusan if the game goes long enough and you're drawing enough cards where he's usually active. You also have the Altar Fire to burn your opponent's win conditions, and then you also have Curse of Agony with Tamsin, which is the main one. That's why it's called Curse Warlock. You just shuffle a ton of Curse in their deck, the Fatigue will end up doing like 72, 76 damage to him, and you'll win the game off of that most of the time, especially if you've burned most of your opponent's resources. And then against aggro decks, you have enough control to basically just win through attrition, similar to how other Warlock and Control decks work. And I run the Entitled Customer because your hand is usually full with this deck or close to it, and having a giant removal on turn 6 is really good, because sometimes you'd have to wait till Twisting Nether, but the Entitled Customer is just a better Twisting Nether. It only sucks against Paladin because of Divine Shields, but other than that, this is just a better card. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, feel free to like, comment, subscribe. It's probably the last tier list I'm going to do for this entire year. Not calendar year, but Hearthstone year. And I will try to put out some cool videos for the new cards and the new set in the near future. I'll see you guys tomorrow, and hope you guys enjoyed. If you guys want to see more gameplay about this class specifically, check the playlist here, and if you want to see just more gameplays in general, check the playlist here.